Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. It, as you know, is Tuesday. It's Fat Tuesday, Mardi Gras, Shrove Tuesday. And here they celebrate Carnival. I'm not sure if that is a long-held tradition or if it's more recent because there is a largish Brazilian population here also. I don't know, but they do celebrate Carnival, and today we just happened to be out for a walk when the celebration was happening, so we got to see the parade, and actually it was funny, I had to reschedule my interview that was scheduled for today for later in the week because our car was parked on the same street as the parade, so we couldn't get the car out, and I couldn't do the interview in our office because the samba music was playing so loud. They had speakers set up all along the streets, and it was so loud that there was no way I could have done an interview, even inside, without samba music blaring in the background. So thankfully, the author for the next episode was very kind, and she laughed at my predicament, but it was fun. It wasn't, I've been to Mardi Gras, and it certainly wasn't that, a lot less nudity. It was a lot like Halloween for the kids. There was lots of kids dressed in what we might consider Halloween costumes, trick-or-treating costumes, and then there was the parade and a lot of dancing and just generally being happy before Lent starts tomorrow on Ash Wednesday. Anyway, I'm really glad that we were in town today, didn't choose to work from home and got to experience it. Our dogs were also on the walk with us, and they weren't thrilled by the noise, although they love their celebrity dog status for the most part. They get more comments, and people just think they're adorable. So that is good. They were a little overwhelmed with the noise, and then there was a ton of kids. They all wanted to pet the dogs, and so that after a while I just had to pick them both up and be like, no more playing with the celebrity dogs because they're getting freaked out. At any rate, that was my day, and it was good. But of course, we are here to discuss books, not Carnival, and I have returning guest Stephanie Kane joining me once again to talk about, as I mentioned, this is a true crime book. It is actually based on experiences that she had, and it involves the murder of her mother-in-law in 1973. She wrote a fictionalized version of this as her first novel called Quiet Time. She talks about that in the interview. But let me go ahead and give you the description of the book, which is called True Crime Redux. And again, the author is Stephanie Kane. The murder of Betty Fry goes unpunished for decades. Kane, ex-wife of Betty's son Doug, finally decides to tell her story by fictionalizing the events she witnessed as well as those about which she simply speculated. The result is the novel Quiet Time. She shortly finds out, however, that fiction can oftentimes accurately mirror reality. In her true crime nonfiction, True Crime Redux, Kane artfully describes the chain of events that followed the publication of her novel and brings a forgotten cold case back to life. She dives deep into the inner workings of modern crime and punishment through the retelling of events she played an involuntary role in. The strikingly transparent report of a brutal homicide engulfs readers from the very first line. True Crime Redux is thus a perfect pick for true crime readers looking for a compelling, true story that leaves no stones unturned. So that is the description, again, of True Crime Redux by Stephanie Kane. And Stephanie, as I said, has been on the podcast before. This is her third time visiting us. Me, I'm not an us, visiting the podcast, and she briefly talked about this book the last time she was on, and I was fascinated. I mean, I was projecting all over the place, and I continue now to project my own feelings and thoughts, and wow, I think I said wow a lot when reading this book, because I can't even imagine being in this situation. Stephanie was 19 when she was engaged to Doug, and when her future mother-in-law was murdered. As I say kind of briefly in the interview, I was not doing any of those things when I was 19. I was still living at home. I hadn't gone to school. I hadn't gone to university yet. Took a couple of years off between high school and college, and so I just was projecting all over the place. But we're going to let Stephanie talk more about that and leave my wows and projections, hopefully, out of it. If you do want to listen to the previous 2 interviews with Stephanie, those are numbers 182 and 284. She's coming back about every 100 episodes, which is kind of funny. Interesting, not really funny. At any rate, let's go ahead and turn now to the interview. Again, it is called True Crime Redux, and the author is Stephanie Kane. Hi, Stephanie. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. We're going to talk about true crime, which is something we don't normally talk about when you're on the podcast. But this time we're talking about your true crime novel. I don't even know what you would call it, kind of a true crime memoir, but we'll get to that. Before we do, though, if you wouldn't mind sharing just a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
So I basically had 3 careers, I guess. After I graduated from college, I was a karate teacher, which actually plays into this true crime story. I did that for a few years. Then I went to law school. When I graduated, I went to work for a big fancy law firm, became a corporate lawyer, then kind of had an epiphany. And after I made partner, I kind of quit, tried to get into medical school at age 40, went back to college and took all these courses I had avoided the first time around, didn't get into medical school. And then I had to go back into the legal world. By then I had resigned my partnership. I had to support myself. So I went to work for a criminal defense lawyer and did trial work for a few years, which I really enjoyed, very unexpectedly so, but I loved it. And then I left that to write mystery stories. And I think that's where, your understanding of me kind of picks up as a mystery writer. So yes, I've had kind of a varied background.
You have, and
all of which I think has helped me to become a writer.
I would think so. And every time you're on and you give the little bit about yourself part, I'm always like, man, I have so many questions that are unrelated to talking about books and being an author. I could spend like an hour just asking you questions about those other careers and not other lives, but you know what I mean.
Well, they kind of all come together in True Crime Redux in a very strange way.
They do. So would you like to give an overview of True Crime Redux?
Yeah, it's basically the story that made me become a writer. It and the very first book I wrote, which is called Quiet Time, which we'll get into in a minute. But those two books are very different takes on the same story, which has basically occupied, the last 50 years of my life. What it is the true story of the murder of a Denver area housewife named Betty Fry in 1973. And the reason it has occupied so much of my life is because it's a very personal story. It happened right before my wedding to her son. And writing that story in all the different iterations that I've written it has basically forced me to come to terms with my role in that murder. The day of the murder, I was one of the last people to speak to Betty, and I was one of the first people to see her killer, who was her husband, Dwayne, who unexpectedly came to the karate studio where my fiance, Doug, was teaching that morning. And the morning has never left my mind. because I came down to the studio to pick up Doug, and there Dwayne was, my soon-to-be father-in-law. And he had a large bruise on his forehead, and he was wearing clothes that were totally inappropriate to the very, very hot, broiling, sunny day. He was wearing dark clothes and behaving very strangely. And the day only got stranger. And then, that afternoon, we had been to a mall to pick up Doug's wedding suit at a fashion bar. This shows you how old this story is. And we came home, the phone was ringing, and, there was somebody saying, "You've got to come home immediately. Something terrible has happened." So that day obviously was like branded in my head. And the other reason, not just because, I talked to Betty and saw Dwayne, but there was a lot of opposition to our marriage by Doug's parents. We even had a question as to whether his mother would attend the wedding. So I knew that there was a lot of tension in the family over our wedding. And, I had this terrible feeling, this fear that somehow the wedding had been a catalyst for this crime. And I should digress for a second and say it was a very brutal crime. Betty was beaten to death in her garage in this nice suburban house, with loot strewn around her body. So it looked like she had maybe surprised a burglar. But very quickly, suspicion turned to Dwayne, and he was indicted and arrested. And then all of a sudden, our lives got caught up in, oh my God, Doug's father's been arrested for murder, and what do we do? And but strangely enough, days before the trial, the charges were dropped. And then nobody ever talked about it again. It was as if nothing had happened. And, we wanted to move on with our lives. But of course, you don't move on from something like that. So fast forward 30 years later, Doug and I were married for about 9 years. In the early 90s, I met my wonderful current husband, John. And I told him, about what had happened, in the Fry family. And he said to me, "Well, why did they drop the charges against Dwayne?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. Nobody ever talked about it. I never looked into it. I tried to move on from it." And he said, "Well, don't you think it's important to find out?" So I went to the county courthouse where the crime had occurred. I got the file, the microfiched file, and it was a very, very small file, surprisingly. But one thing that it did have in it was the grand jury testimony of the lead cop from 1973. And that gave me a glimpse of the crime scene. So I started to write about it, and I just fictionalized the story from there. And basically, so all I had when I wrote Quiet Time, my first published book, was memories of that day and the lead cop's transcript. And I think the emotional reason I wrote it was because I wanted and needed Betty's story to come out right, which meant the killer caught and punished and myself exonerated, and all of that. But the challenge I faced back then was I'd never written fiction or even taken a writing class. I was a lawyer. So Quiet Time became my lab for learning the writing craft. And because it was fiction, I was able to give it a very satisfying ending. So it was published by Bantam the week of 9/11, and it had a very short life and a quick death. And I moved on to write, the other books that you and I have talked about over the years, which were mysteries, nothing to do with Betty Fry. And so that's how I came to write Quiet Time.
I'm actually going to jump in here to take the first break of this episode. There is more to that answer. We're going to segue from Quiet Time into how that turned into the events leading to True Crime Redux. But before we do that, we're going to take that first break. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking once again with author Stephanie Kane about her true crime book, True Crime Redux. And she was just talking about the fictionalized version of that book, writing that, and then the events that led. And now we're going to segue into the events that led to the writing of this book. So let's go ahead and get back to that interview with Stephanie.
And then a very strange thing happened in 2005, 4 years after Quiet Time was, basically, dead, almost out of print. I had been interviewed on a local TV show, public TV show about books when Quiet Time came out. And, of course, I said it was complete fiction, and it was. But that station lost its funding, and it just kept rerunning these old, at midnight there'd be like these old interviews that they ran. And one of those interviews was of me. And in 2005, Dwayne, my former father-in-law, the killer's sister, who was by then in her late 70s, happened to be up watching. And she saw me interviewed on this show, and she went out and she bought Quiet Time. And that, in kind of a crisis of conscience, impelled her to come forward with information about a confession that Dwayne had made to their mother. So a cold case was open. And, I found out about it because one of the cold case cops sent me an email saying, "Were you Stephanie Fry? And will you talk to us?" And, I told them what I knew, what I remembered from that day, and I became a prosecution witness, which meant that I became a target of the defense. So, that took up, it sidetracked my writing. I had, had this nice contract with Bantam and then one with Scribner, and I published 4 books, and all of a sudden I was a witness in a cold case, and I just shut down completely because the defense was subpoenaing all of my drafts of Quiet Time. I was afraid to write anything down. I was afraid to work on any project for fear that they would somehow connect it to that and make that be a target. And, for the several years that the cold case dragged on, I did not write a word. I didn't take a note. I didn't do anything. I just completely psychologically shut down until it was over. And then when it ended in 2010, I got the police files, the witness interviews, the transcripts and reports from 1973 and 2005. That was like thousands of pages, including crime scene photos and audio tapes of witness interviews. But I still had questions because it was a very brutal crime. And Dwayne was, a very buttoned down, sort of cold engineer. And my main question was what had actually led up to that brutal explosion that day in the garage. And I also wondered, as a mystery writer, and a lawyer, what did the crime scene tell investigators that maybe hadn't made it into the official file, especially in 1973, because that file was pretty sparse. But what I was really looking for was context to understand how a seemingly cool-headed, ordinary engineer could commit such a violent crime. So that led me for the next 4 years to interview witnesses on both sides of the family. I located the cop who had led the investigation in 1973, and I flew to Arizona to talk to him. I picked the brains of forensic experts. I use all of my like lawyerly research skills and mystery writer, questions and stuff to try to pull the case together. And that became the origin of True Crime Redux. And, the challenge there was by then I had a billion facts, way too many facts. And I had to keep narrowing it down and trying to cut a path through the thicket of all of this information, which I would have given my right arm for, in the 1990s when I was trying to write Quiet Time. But anyway, so that's basically how True Crime Redux came to be. And I was still trying to come to grips with my role in the story. And that was the obsession that sort of drove all of that research and trying to bring it together in some sort of comprehensible form.
It really is amazing. I mean, true crime podcasts are everywhere. True crime people have a fascination with true crime. But to know someone even peripherally who is part of one of those stories is just, and I kept projecting myself into your situation as I was reading the book and just thinking, oh my gosh, how did anybody, I had so many questions. But the fact that you were 19 when this happened, I don't even remember what I was doing at 19, but it wasn't getting married and, being part of a murder investigation. So I just find the whole thing really fascinating. And the fact that it came back because you started writing a fictionalized version is crazy. That's the only word I can really come up with. Did you find the writing of both the fictionalized version and then True Crime Redux helpful for your own? You're never really going to get closure because there wasn't much closure in the case itself, but did it help you to kind of settle some things for yourself?
Well, I thought that I had catharsis when I wrote Quiet Time. And in fact, I did everything I could to make it not be identifiable with the Fry case. I wrote it under my second husband's name, which is my pen name, Kane. I fictionalized it, tremendously. And then when Bantam bought it, I was very honest about the origins of it. So it had to go through their legal review, and they made me make even more changes, some of which were kind of crazy. They made me change Denver to Widmark and Boulder to Stanley, and Colorado was never mentioned. It was an unnamed state north of New Mexico. So, I did everything I could to put it to rest so that it would never come back on anyone. And when it popped up again in the cold case, when I got involved when a cold case originated from it, I was just stunned. And then I had to confront all sorts of other things, like, one of the most difficult things was facing the people in court who I had fictionalized, in Quiet Time, and, thought I would never see or have anything to do with again. So new things kept coming up that had to, I had to resolve. And one of the repeating questions that I always had was sort of an ethical one. What right do I have to tell this story? And actually, I did not resolve that until I interviewed a guy named Howard Morton, who was sort of an expert that I contacted in writing True Crime Redux. He'd had some involvement in bringing the cold case about, and he had founded this advocacy group called FOVAP, Families of Victims of Homicide and Missing Persons. And it's basically, an advocacy group for the families of cold case victims. And he had started it because his eldest son, Guy, had been murdered in Arizona, I think back in 1986, and the murderer had never been caught. So Howard, he's now, I think, in his 80s. He obviously, you never get over that. So, I found him through LinkedIn, and I sent him this I drafted this 2-page letter explaining who I was and all this. And then I got into LinkedIn and they give you like 40 words. So I barely had, room to introduce myself. And to my shock, my very pleasant surprise, he got back to me immediately by email. He knew who I was. He had read Quiet Time, and he was willing to talk. So I think the next day we had this very long, hours-long conversation about cold cases and how you never get over it. And he gave me the validation that I actually had never realized I was really looking for. He understood why I could not how the case had affected me and why I could not put it to rest until I found out all of the facts that I possibly could. So he gave me validation and, whatever passes for closure, which I think as I can conceive of it is the ability to move on with your life. And he told me that that's basically what the families of cold case victims are looking for. They just, he couldn't speak for all of them, but for himself and his wife and most of the people he knew, justice was an abstraction. Most of them didn't care about vengeance. What they really wanted to know was what happened and why. Because without understanding that, you can't move on with your life. So True Crime Redux is as close as I will ever come to understanding what happened and my own role in it, and that I had a legitimate interest in trying to get to the bottom of it. I've gone as far as I can with it, and I feel, this is the catharsis I think I was looking for when I wrote Quiet Time.
Time for our second break for this episode. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Stephanie Kane about her book True Crime Redux. Let's return to that interview.
There's a lot of different elements in the book in terms of the research that you did, but there's some talk of things like family systems. And you actually, because you and Doug were only married for 9 years, you got out of that family system. So you were looking at it from a different point of view. You weren't in the status quo of the family system. So I would imagine that gave you a different perspective than being, still within that system and everyone, because the family kind of was like, no, it's done, it's over, we don't want to think about it anymore.
Well, I was and I wasn't part of that family system, because one of the feelings that made me feel so, in some way, small way, responsible for what happened is the fact that I was an outsider coming into a very closed family system. And I was never really accepted by that family. So although I had, some kind of, I certainly identified with it. I was married to their son and, very loyal to him and all that. But I didn't really identify with the larger family because they basically pretty much shut me out. But I did identify very closely with Doug as my husband. So in that sense, I was part of that family system. But the family was always kind of a mystery to me because they didn't function the way my family did. My family was very ethnic, very, they fight and talk about anything. And there wasn't a lot of secrets within the family. The Fry family, I would say, was a much more closed family, and it was certainly closed to me, which probably made it a lot easier for me to look at it from the outside as I try to do in True Crime Redux.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mentioned some of the research and things. Can you talk about the way you set up the structure of the book with various excerpts and quotes at the beginnings of the chapter? Did you have a structure in mind for the way you wanted the book to go, and then you found the different excerpts in order for those chapters, or just talk about how you set up the structure?
Well, the structure, this is why I say this book has been a book I've been working on for 50 years. And actually, True Crime Redux went through several iterations before it became True Crime Redux. So we've talked about Quiet Time. That was a totally fictionalized version. But in around 2016, after I'd done all my research, I tried to write it as a traditional true crime. I called it Cold Justice. And by then I had too many facts, and I just had all of these different voices talking in my head from the transcripts and all of that. And I tried to really corral it into a very tight linear procedural. And the result was it attracted a top New York agent and several publishers, but the book never sold. And I think, nobody came out and said this, but I think the reason it didn't sell was because I had purged it of all the emotion and the texture in trying to corral it into this linear procedural. And, the story was uninteresting and flat. So I came to realize, I hadn't wanted to write it in first person. I told myself, you had your catharsis with Quiet Time. Now just get out of the way, step out of it. But the story was much more personal. So what I did in my frustration was I turned to a blog. And a blog is basically a serialized personal essay. It's not modern. In the 19th century, Charles Dickens' first novel, Pickwick Papers, was published in 20 weekly magazine installments. So, it has some kind of proud antecedents. But for me, it became a vehicle to rediscover Betty's story by making it my own, with all of the messy emotions that were part of that. So what I decided to do was condense the intensity of it into first person 500 to 800 word blog posts. And they ran on my website weekly for about a year. But I also wanted to tell it in my own voice, but I also wanted to put it under a larger lens that would maybe add up to something bigger. And the lens that I chose was storytelling. Because as a writer, I kept being struck by how the murder and the cold case were these two distinct stories, and how every time the DA and the defense kept hijacking the story to spin these competing tales that had alternative beginnings, middles, and ends, and which I could well recognize because by then I'd written, several books and I understood dramatic structure. So I decided that I would frame each blog post with a storytelling device, like, red herrings and scapegoats and, how you recast roles to make somebody a hero or a villain. And so storytelling became kind of my unifying theme. And it gave, Betty's story a context that made sense to me as a writer. And so, it became a blog. And then some lovely, friendly friend who was a podcaster said, you should make this into a book. Just pull these blog posts together into a book. And so I just, I converted it to an ebook. And that ebook had the same unconventional style, these short, tense installments that had these headers that were quotes or definitions, most of which related to storytelling. And that attracted a publisher because it was an unconventional style and it was kind of a new take on true crime. So I would call True Crime Redux a non-traditional true crime. But once I actually saw it all printed out, I realized that, there were things I liked. I wanted to keep the format that you're referring to, these short chapters, each of which kicked off with a definition or a quote. But I also realized that it made the book very, very choppy. And that goes back to the expectations of a reader. When a reader's reading a blog, you can dip in and dip out. So every post has to stand alone. And you also have to keep reintroducing characters and details to remind the reader of who they are. But in a book, a reader quite legitimately expects the story to, have a dramatic structure. They expect to be introduced to the narrator in not just these short little bites, but, in a larger sense of who that person is. And they expect to be able to read it straight through without being burdened by reintroducing stuff they've already seen. So I started to think that the challenge now was to create some connective tissue that pulled all of these short chapters together. So what I tried to do, I did an introduction so that the readers could know who I was and what my stake in the story was. I added a list of persons involved so that, I could take out all that redundant reintroduction. And if a reader, thought, oh, wait, is this the cop from 73 or from 2005? They could just page back to the cast and immediately know who that person was without being burdened by it. But I did keep those short quotes because I really wanted to make the story immediate and dynamic. So some of the chapters, as you know, come from transcripts and police reports. And that was to provide larger context, not just my voice, but larger context. And also to make the story immediate and dynamic, because those people were speaking in 1973, and these are their words, or they were speaking in 2005. Some of the chapters are headed by definitions, and that was to inject a bolt of objective reality, because words have clear meanings. And finally, the personal reason I did it that way in the first place and why I wanted to keep it is because having those tight little quotes kicking off a chapter oriented and disciplined myself to focus and to keep those chapters tight. And I think I was haunted. My first agent, who was the agent for Quiet Time, advised me early on. She said, never write in first person, because in first person, you just, the narrator just runs away with the book. So don't write in first person, write in third person. And so I was always very aware of, the perils of writing in first person. And when I realized that the only way I could write my definitive take on this story was to go to first person, I just really wanted to keep myself under kind of a tight leash with it. So that was the reason for the quotes and the definitions kicking off these short, kind of very intense chapters.
Well, and it worked because you couldn't find a publisher for the first version of it, but then doing it, I think, in those segments and really putting yourself into it more probably made it more attractive in some ways.
Yeah, well, it became a real story.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at it objectively, I don't mean to be callous, but a victim who is not famous, who is just a housewife, beaten to death in her garage, it's not the kind of story that grabs people's attention. They're used to serial killers now and famous people and all of that. And this had none of that. It was a very quiet story, actually. So, to make it be something that would be worth reading, you have to introduce some level of experience beyond the simple facts of the crime itself. So I think that, that I was willing to enter it in such an emotional and dynamic way is what made the story, interesting to this publisher, and also that it was told in kind of an unconventional way.
Yeah, absolutely.
With the short, tense chapters and the quotes and stuff like that to give it context.
Mm-hmm.
Time for our final break of the podcast. When we come back, Stephanie will be talking about what writing might look like for her as she moves forward. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back. pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets podcast is for you. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Stephanie Kane.
And you wrote this book because of very specific circumstances, but would you consider writing nonfiction in the future, or do you prefer sticking with the fiction and the mysteries?
I'm not sure that I can go back to writing mysteries, to be perfectly honest with you. I mean, I would love nothing more than to tell you, oh, I'm working on this new mystery and here it is and here's a teaser, but I'm not. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is that this story is the story that made me want to write in the first place. And I've now written it in the way that I would have given anything to be able to have written it 30 years ago. But I didn't have the skill and I didn't have the facts. So in a sense, this story has kind of bookended my writing career. Now, I don't want to say that I'll never write again. I mean, I love writing. It's an extension of the way I think, so it's very important to me. But I think that it would be very difficult to go back to long form fiction for me now. I think that I love the shorter form. I mean, this experience may have ruined me for longer form stuff because I really like writing in that tight, compressed way. It's a discipline that I embrace. And so I think, I'm interested in writing some short stories, which would obviously be fiction. But long form fiction, I think it would kind of feel like a step back for me. I'm not saying I would never do it. If I found something that I was interested in exploring, for sure I would. But that's kind of where I'm at now. So I think I'd be more likely to write short form essays or short stories than to go back to long form fiction of any type, genre or not.
Have you taken a break from writing after True Crime Redux, or are you working on anything at the moment? I'm thinking about some essays and some short stories. And that's as far as I can honestly say. Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough.
I'm actively working on a long form project.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any specific hopes for what readers might take away from True Crime Redux?
Yeah, I hope that they take the human aspects away. That murder doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that it can have a lasting impact. And really, going back to what Howard Morton told me, when the killer walks, the case never dies, and that has a huge emotional impact on the people involved. It's also a family story. Betty was she wasn't a famous person, but she was a real woman whose death rippled through the family and through larger systems. The personal thing that I hope readers can take away is how getting caught up in a murder can shape your life. I don't know who I would have been, had I not met Doug, as a freshman in college and gone down that path. I mean, I like to think I wouldn't have been too different than how I ended up. But, it for sure, it's shaped my life. It certainly shaped my writing career. And finally, the justice system. It's not an abstraction. It's actually made up of fallible human beings who make mistakes and who dump cases because they're lazy or they're scared of the opposition. I mean, it seems so strange as a lawyer and the wife of a judge to be saying this, but it gave me, the Cole case gave me a completely different view of the justice system. And I'd done some criminal defense trial work before that, so I shouldn't have been so surprised by it. But anyway, there's that aspect of it too, and I hope readers take all of that away from it.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm not like, I don't listen to true crime podcasts or anything like that. I have friends who do, but I think sometimes the fascination can be around a lot of the sensationalism with the stories that they choose to tell on podcasts of that nature. And this is not that. It really is the personal side of what happens when something devastating like this happens in a family.
Yeah, and I go back to Howard Morton again. I mean, he put it all together for me. You know, and it's a simple human need to know what happened. Because I think I could probably accept almost anything if I understood what happened and why. Because, there's a human resilience, and you come to grips with it and it becomes part of you, but you're able to move on with your life. But if there's this gaping hole, what happened? Was I to blame? Who did it? Why did they do it? What, you just can't, it's like, you just have this kind of hole in you. And, that's why they say there's no such thing as closure, because you never close a book on somebody you cared about who has been violently taken from you. But at the same time, what gives you the tools to move on with your life are simple things that you don't think of if you're not involved in one of these things, which is just the simple need to understand what happened. Not some lofty abstraction like justice or vengeance. It's just what happened, what happened to my son, what happened to my sister. And you're just haunted until you know that. You don't have the opportunity to assimilate it and move on because you have nothing to assimilate.
Yeah, absolutely. When you write something like this, I can only imagine, and you spent years working on it. So it would take a lot of your focus, I would imagine. What kinds of things do you read to take yourself out of those tense moments, or maybe not escapist reading, but just reading that's different from what you're working on?
Well, I'm not much for escape. I hate to admit that. In fact, fiction, once I started writing it really seriously, became not an escape for me at all. It became something that I read, and I could see, the dramatic structure, but I could see it from a writer's point of view. And so it became hard for me to just like vanish into fiction. So I started reading more nonfiction. And most of the time when I was writing books, I was reading nonfiction to get information that I could, use as research and would inspire other things. Lately, the last really good fiction book I read is by a Denver writer named Mark Stevens. It's called The Fireballer. And strangely enough, it's a baseball book, but it's not a baseball book. It's just a wonderful book about a baseball player who comes to grips with a tragedy in his past. And I love that book. That's the last fiction I read. And then for nonfiction, I'm like a sucker for these books about sort of memoirs that are about growing up in a dysfunctional family, like The Glass Castle and Educated or Education by Tara Westover, and how people climb out of these really strange families and go on to lead rewarding lives. So mostly I don't escape into fiction, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to do that at some point once I've stopped writing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes it's hard when you do something either professionally or even as a hobby to then experience that outside of how you do it, or like you find I would find myself in a past career constantly picking apart things and not paying attention and being in the moment, but like, why did they do it this way? How come they didn't do that? I would have done it this way.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, how about internet presence? I know you have a website, so if you can share website and any social media that you're active on where people can find you.
My website is Writer Kane. That's Kane. So Kane with a K.com. And I've got an Amazon author page under Stephanie Kane. And I think that is I'm at author Stephanie Kane is my Facebook. And that's about the extent to which I'm on social media, I hate to admit.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Stephanie, we've talked about a variety of different things during our time together, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you want to make sure you highlight?
Well, it's just that, every writer comes to writing, with a different expectation and a different goal and a different whole reason why they become a writer. Getting to the bottom of Betty's story was kind of the reason I became a writer, though I loved mysteries and Alfred Hitchcock and Twilight Zone when I was a kid. But what makes me want to write, just me personally, is an idea, something that I want to come to grips with. And I can't find a way to come to grips with it until I put it into writing. So that's how I roll as a writer, which, maybe explains why I'm not working on anything at this very moment. And I know other writers come to it, for different reasons and in different ways. But frankly, the identity of writer has never been anything that has been motivating for me. It's always just being the writing itself. And what motivates the writing is an idea that I want to explore. So that's just how I come to writing.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you again for taking the time to talk to me. Coming back on the podcast, I really appreciate it.
Thanks a million for having me. I always learn so much when I talk to you.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thank you again to Stephanie for joining me for a third time on the podcast, this time to talk about a very personal story. And, I'm sure writing a fictionalized version of those events was cathartic or helpful in some ways, but I can only imagine what it would have been like to first relive everything through the cold case and then the reopening of that cold case and then writing a nonfiction version of those events. And so thank you to her for not only joining me on the podcast, but also sharing those events and sharing her own process in going through those very difficult times and trying to make some sense of them. As a reader, it's again, I put myself into the story and projected like crazy as to how I would react, but there are real people at the center of every true crime podcast that you listen to or book that you read, and to hear from someone who was in the middle of those types of events, I think is very powerful and very profound and really gives, again, a personal insight into something that might just seem kind of sensationalized or exciting or interesting to read or listen to. So thank you to Stephanie for being that voice and putting herself out there to talk about those events. I really, really appreciate it. And if you are a true crime fan, then you should definitely check out True Crime Redux to just read through all the events and what it was like and all the stuff. It's you watch. We all know that shows on television are not always accurate, especially when it comes to like legal shows, right? Because they have to do things for television to make them more exciting. But to read through the events of both trials and the process of trying to solve this murder and convict someone for this murder is it was very interesting to me just to see how that worked and how it didn't work in some cases. So if you're, like I said, if you're a fan of true crime, then you should definitely check out True Crime Redux. And hopefully you will, of course, join me for the next episode after I rescheduled due to my being held captive by Carnival today. That episode will come out on Friday, and that author is Suzanne Dunlap. We are switching to historical fiction taking place before, during, and after the French Revolution, but focusing on a a true historical figure named Adelaide, who was a painter during that time, not well known, but very interesting life and very interesting story. So I'm looking forward to speaking with Suzanne about that novel, and hopefully you will join me for that episode. As always, if you are a fan of this podcast and would like to help me out by getting it to more listeners, you can do a few things, like follow and subscribe, whatever option you have on whatever platform you listen to the podcast on. That way you'll always know when there are new episodes out. You can also leave a review on that platform. That can be written, it can be starred. Again, whatever options are available on the platform that you listen on. That really helps this podcast to get to more listeners like yourselves. And then, of course, we are on social media. So follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. As always, I love hearing from listeners, so come find me, let me know what you're reading, talk to me about what's going on in your life as a reader. In the meantime, I hope you're having a great week. I know that it's dumping snow in a lot of places in the U.S., so stay safe, I can get that out, stay safe, stay warm, and I hope that if you are staying inside and staying warm and safe, you have plenty of time to get yourself lost in a really good book. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.